morning, everyone. Thank you for being here in the mayor's office. I am Olga George, the City of Pittsburgh and Mayor Ed Gainey's press secretary. We thank you for being here for our first fireside chat type of press conference in which Mayor Ed Gainey and Deputy Mayor Pawlak will be discussing the release of the 5-year forecast, revenue forecast report that was presented to the Joint Task Force yesterday. We're going to start with their conversation, and then of course after their conversation we will open up to questions from the media that is here. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Olga. Good morning, Deputy Mayor.
Good morning, Mayor.
Hey, listen, first I just want to say thank you and tell you how much I appreciate your work. We know we still got a long way to go, but the one thing we've been through the years is transparent in terms of where we at with our budget, and always making sure that people know the truth about our budget. And for that, I want to say I appreciate you and thank you, because I think that's very important that our fiscal management is strong and solid. But what made you want to release the report this time? Like, we've never released a report. Yeah. This is the first time we released a report. What was behind our thinking in terms of really releasing the report?
Sure. So we made a lot of changes to the process this year, Mayor. Earlier in the spring, you formed the Joint Task Force on City Finances, which includes representation from the administration, from the Controller's Office, and from City Council, including the Council Budget Office and the Council Finance Chair. And through that process, we've been committing to a higher level of transparency and a new set of ways in which we're closely looking at the financial numbers for the city to ensure that all of the important stakeholders in city government, as well as the public, can have confidence in where city finances are. And so yesterday, this revenue forecast was presented to the Joint Task Force. There's always been some degree of that process. Since the beginning of the Act 47 era, the Controller, Council Budget Office, and OMB have met to review the projection, and ultimately they need to be certified. But this was a wider discussion with the full task force's participation yesterday, and so we thought it was also important to bring the public in and to share that preliminary projection with everyone to show, based on our calculations and our best sense of what we can reasonably expect to bring in revenue next year and through 2029, where we are as we're starting to build out the plans for the 2025 budget.
And as we talk about the budget, one of the things that we discussed going forward a couple months ago is bringing this committee together to be more transparent, so that we're sharing information with everybody, the City Controller's Office, City Council, so that everybody is on one page. We thought that was extremely important because there was so much different rhetoric out there. In order to cut through the rhetoric, we talked about having this committee so we could be more transparent. Can you talk a little bit about the committee? What do you see in the committee? So let me ask you questions. One, what do you see in the committee, and how is the committee functioning as a unit?
Sure. So we meet monthly, and the agenda for the Joint Task Force meetings changes based on where we are in the cycle. Every time we've produced a quarterly financial report, we've reviewed that in detail, taking questions from the other elected leaders or their staff who are participating in the meeting, so that we have a common understanding of the current picture of city finances. We have explored the revenue modeling process, so the steps that the finance department takes in putting together these revenue projections. We discussed in detail at a meeting earlier this year, again, to build a baseline of understanding and comfort with how we would arrive at these projections. Yesterday, we walked through line by line the projections, and Director Gula and Deputy Director Fitzgerald from Finance explained to the full group what data was used and what assumptions were used in producing the calculations, so that everyone didn't just have the numbers but had a comprehensive understanding of how we arrived at them. That's going to continue to be the focus of the Joint Task Force through the rest of the year and into the future. Early in the year, we'll be looking at actual financial results from the previous year and the quarterly reports. As we get into budget season now, we'll be talking about revenue. And I expect this fall, in addition to the conversations conversations we're going to be having at the council table and with others about our proposed budget. We'll also be digging into some of those details with this group to, again, hopefully promote alignment and understanding and a common sense of at least the facts of the city's financial picture.
You know, we've always talked about and have demonstrated the ability to be transparent when it comes to our administration, particularly the budget process, and we've consistently done that. Let's talk about the second quarterly report and the revenue forecast. Now, a lot of people may not even understand the language I'm using right now when we're talking to the broader community, but how can we break it down so that they understand the difference between those two items?
Sure. So the second quarter financial report looks backwards. It looks at what actually happened in between January, the beginning of January and the end of June this year. What revenues actually came in, what spending actually went out. It takes us about 45 days after the end of the quarter to produce those reports because we have to close the books on that quarter in order to have accurate numbers. So that report looks backwards. It tells us what the first half of the year looked like. It's important because as we're putting together the revenue projections now and the budget, it informs where we expect to be at the end of the year. It's our most accurate picture of where we think we'll be financially at the end of December. That tells us what the reserve balance will look like. That in turn tells us what we can budget for next year. We will update those figures when we finish the third quarter report before the final budget. But as we prepare for the preliminary budget, it's the most accurate information we have. And what it tells us is that the city will end the year with a surplus just under $4 million. We have seen revenues in some categories come in below what they were previously projected to be. That's not a surprise. We saw signs of that in the first quarterly report. Sure. It's clearer now. We have more information about the appeal of property taxes, both due to the common level ratio court case and the appeals coming out of that, as well as vacancy rates downtown that we've been talking about for a while. But we've also seen two other trends that help us level that out. One is that as we've brought the collection of past tax balances back in-house from what had previously been collected by an outside provider, we've seen a lot more of that money coming in. The finance department has been better able to collect those taxes and get folks current than was the case before, and that's offset some of the cost of the refunds. The second is, and I'm proud to say this, we believe strongly that we'll come in $25 million under budget in terms of spending this year, thanks to work in OMB, but also in all city departments and across the city in managing spending, achieving our objectives less expensively than we had originally thought would be the case, and those savings ultimately add up to the benefit of the taxpayers in a surplus at the end of this year. So that's what the second quarterly report tells us. The 5-year financial forecast looks from January 1st, 2025 into the future 5 years and predicts what our revenues likely will be based on everything we know. So quarterly report looks backwards. The financial forecast looks forward.
And how do they come up with those numbers? When we're talking about the next 5 years, sure. You and I discussed the budget over 5 years and how the Department of Finance really comes up accurately with those numbers. Let's talk about, to give the people an understanding, how we arrived at that 5-year plan.
Yeah, so the 5-year forecast, it's a very scientific calculation. We take what we know about this year and recent years in terms of collections. We look at national data, right? So statistics that are published by various government, like federal government agencies or leading entities, companies that help us predict things like interest rates, cost increases, wage escalation. Wage escalation, for example, tells us how much we might expect in income tax. The changes in the property market, property values and housing sales tell us what property taxes or the realty transfer tax will do. And so based on calculations that take into account historical data and trends and predictions in data sets, we then predict how much certain revenue lines will grow or decrease over time. It's a very conservative calculation, meaning we try and err on the side of calculating less revenue. We'd rather project that we'll get a certain number and actually end up collecting more than that than overshoot and have to deal with collecting less than we thought. That doesn't always work, and particularly when the market changes. But we take conservative assumptions and project what we think we can actually collect over time. And then we base our spending plans on what we think we'll be bringing in.
You know, what we discussed early on, and we have continued to do this and make sure that we improve it every year, is core city services. We understand that we had to get back to the business of delivering quality city services. How does these numbers reflect the level of quality we will be able to give our core city services?
Yeah, so where that will really come into a clear picture is at the end of next month when you release your proposed preliminary budget, where we articulate a spending plan. But here's what we can tell from these numbers. We're expecting a 5.5% reduction in revenue next year. This doesn't come as a surprise. We were saying as early as this time in 2022 that was likely. We knew that ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, funds that have been supporting our operating budget will no longer be available for that purpose next year, and that accounts for the biggest percentage of the drop. We also knew that the common level ratio decision and changes in the downtown real estate market post-COVID were going to mean that property taxes could be impacted. And we knew that as long as interest rates stayed high, as they have, that would, on the one hand, create a tight housing market that would reduce realty transfer tax revenue, but on the other hand, mean that our investment income would remain high. So we've known all of this for several years, but as we've gotten closer and closer to January 2025, we have more and more data to tell us exactly what the impacts will be. We know the number of appeal cases that have been filed. We know the amount of appeal adjustments we've had to incorporate into our tax base. We know where interest rates are and remain today and how that's affecting both of those revenue streams. And so based on updated calculations that take those trends we knew were coming but didn't exactly know the magnitude of, we're projecting a 5.5% revenue drop next year. Starting in 2026 and thereafter, we are seeing revenues growing again by just under 2%, between 1.5% and 2% every year in this forecast. What that will mean for services is that we'll have to fit our spending into those parameters. That's a challenge, but it's one we've been preparing for several years and one that we can handle. We knew when we released the 2023 proposed budget, which was adopted, that the investments in city services we made at that time would have to be something we could continue even as revenue contracted in 25 and 26. We knew the same thing in 2020 last year when we produced this year's budget. So all of our spending plans have accounted for the fact that in particular the years 2025 and 2026 would have some limitations. We're updating all of those plans right now in anticipation of the preliminary budget, but it's not a drastically different picture than we were expecting. And because we've been able to achieve savings every year, like I said, we're projecting to come in $25 million under budget this year. That data also goes into the calculations. And so the residents of the city should be confident that we'll be able to continue to provide high quality city services without drastic cuts or reductions in their quality. We're adjusting the way we're paying for them in order, based on new understandings about how we've saved money over the years, to make sure we're accurately predicting what that cost will be. But those investments are safe.
Yeah, this, one thing we always hear from our residents is core city services, and we've done a lot to improve. And that's why I wanted to ask the question. But how should the residents feel about the forecast going forward when we talk about the revenue forecast? How should they feel? We know that there's been a lot of instability based on some comments that have been made without really full knowledge of data, I'll say.
Yeah.
So how should the residents feel about the revenue forecast coming forward?
Again, I can say that this forecast gives me a great deal of confidence that the city is in sound financial shape and that there isn't cause for alarm, right? Just like any government, any business, any personal budget, right, we have to adjust to the circumstances we find ourselves in and plan accordingly. Really, the city of Pittsburgh, I think, is in the good financial shape that it is because we've remained committed to the 5-year budgeting process.
Correct.
Most municipalities in Pennsylvania don't do that. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania doesn't do that. Right? They're only looking 1 year ahead. And where municipalities have gotten themselves into financial trouble, it's usually not because of major shocks to the system. It's because they weren't looking far enough ahead to be able to identify trends early and plan for them. Right? Because we have this 5-year planning process, the challenges we're facing right now were things we saw coming 2 years ago and began planning for it. So as long as we remain committed to that process, I know you're committed to that process, the Office of Management and Budget and Finance are, City Council is, staying committed to that process is the key to being ready for all of this. And I also want to note that something that the forecast doesn't show, but that is important. The other pressure that we're going to see in the next few years is paying off some of the city's longstanding debts.
Correct.
We have a major debt retirement in 2026. That means that in 2027 we'll be paying a lot less in basically in interest payments on loans that the city took out years ago. And between that and the just under 2% revenue growth in 2026, 2027 looks like a very good year for us. And after that, we're in great shape. We can handle the next 2 years because we've been seeing them coming.
The rating agencies from the beginning said that we were sound when it came to fiscal management. There was always a disparity between our numbers and the city controller's numbers. Yeah. What was the disparity in that?
You're right about the rating agencies. When they look at our ability to repay our debt, they've always had a very confident and positive outlook on us. Again, that goes to fiscal management practices like the 5-year budget cycle, like the ways in which we do our calculations, like the good work that the city's been doing to maintain healthy reserve funds and put funding into the pension fund. I think a lot of municipalities are facing real fiscal challenges this year. We're hearing from local governments all across the state about what the impact of ARPA funding going away will mean, what the impact of, again, changing office real estate markets will mean. A lot of folks are in a precarious position, and if you're not looking closely at or really sort of well informed about our particular numbers, it would stand to reason that if everyone is facing challenges, so should Pittsburgh. But the story of the city's actual numbers are very different. And that's because we've been down this road for a long time. And we've, over many years, taken the steps necessary to prevent ourselves from having to be in that position. So I think some of the concerns that we heard earlier in the year are uninformed understandings of where we are based on where people assume the city is because of past financial challenges, but those days are behind us, and we're in good shape.
And that's why I'm glad we brought the committee together to be able to debunk a lot of the misinformation that was out there. Because one thing I've always said, and why I say thank you, is that we always wanted to be transparent and be truthful about exactly where our budget process is. And never after, we know we had to look at the budget, we knew that we had some skinny years coming, but we were always transparent about that. Let me ask this question. The ARPA funds are running out. How do we fill that gap?
Well, revenue recovery has been strong if you look at the big picture of how far things fell off during the height of COVID and the workplace shutdowns, and when many people weren't working, they weren't spending money. Tax revenue dropped dramatically during that time. It's important that everyone remember that the purpose of ARPA funds was to help municipalities deal with those steep declines in revenue that resulted from COVID, on the understanding that revenue was going to slowly bounce back, and that everyone needed a bridge to get through that period. And ARPA has served as that for us, even as we're seeing drops now due to other longer-term impacts of COVID on the real estate market. It did help us cover the much bigger gap, the much more concerning, frankly, gap that we saw during those COVID years. And we're now financially positioned to do exactly what the plan was when ARPA was enacted, move off of those funds because we've had enough time to rebalance and readjust. So, again, we see a dip because we won't have those funds anymore, but it's one that's well within our ability to adjust for because we've been planning for it.
Coming out of the office of O&B, as we have this fireside chat, what do you want the public to know about the process of O&B when it comes to the budget?
Yeah, I think I want everyone to know how seriously we take our work, and that our first commitment is to the residents of the city and ensuring that every dollar that they pay in taxes is put to its highest and best use in providing them public services. However, no one benefits if we spend more than we can afford, right? And so we have a delicate balancing act that we work on where we have a responsibility and an obligation to the residents to make sure that anything we invest in any given budget, we can maintain, right? That we can afford for the long term, and the 5-year process helps us see that. And so I know, every August and September, as you are meeting with the OMB team and we're reviewing everyone's requests, those are always tough meetings and tough decisions because we love to do every great idea, right? And we've found ways to implement a lot of great changes in the ways in which basic services are delivered, and even some more innovative things are done. But we've always had to do that with a balance. And I think we've arrived at a strong balance in the last few budgets. This year, we will not be able to make as many new investments as we did the last 2 years because of what's coming up, but we're going to be able to keep funding those things that have been initiated in the past 3 years because of the way we've planned ahead.
Last year, certain departments and individuals were talking about they have no choice but to raise taxes, and we didn't raise taxes going forward. OMB came and said we don't have to raise taxes. Here's how we can manage it. Can you explain how that process came to be?
Yeah, so again, there are other municipalities that are weighing tax increases right now to deal with these same financial challenges. We're not in a position of needing to do that. We can continue to provide the level of municipal services that we currently provide with the tax rates that we have now. Again, I'll point to that comes from forethought and planning, right? Places that are needing to raise taxes largely are having to do so because they weren't looking as far enough ahead, and as a result, in order to maintain their level of services that they have now, with less coming in property tax values, they have to raise the rate to keep the revenues consistent. But for the same reason that we're in good shape across the board, we don't have to make that decision right now.
Well, listen, again, I want to say thank you. I know Olga's giving us the sign, like, wrap it up, before she come over here. Sure. But I just want to say this in front of everybody. I appreciate your diligence in dealing with the budget and being able to provide with OMB the type of solutions and concepts that we can look over and make sure that we choose the right one to keep the city in a strong fiscal standpoint. Yeah. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank OMB. And I know that we've overcome a lot of the conversations about the budget, but we always said from day one, before we speak, we'll let the numbers speak for themselves. Yeah. The numbers have spoken, and we've never tried to make people fearful. We've never tried to come out and say things that was not true about the budget. We talked about our concerns, and we also talked about the way we manage our concerns. Mm-hmm. I just believe that when people start trying to make, different conversations and have people live in fear because of the way they see the budget, I don't think that's quality management. Mm-hmm. I think quality management is the ability to be transparent and talk about exactly where we're at. Fear tactics does nothing. Mm-hmm. And that's why I want to say thank you, because we never led by fear, we led by hope. And I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for your leadership that's letting us to follow that course.
Mm-hmm. At this time, we will open to questions from the media. I ask, because we are live streaming for the residents, that questions, if you have questions, please alert me so we can have the mic so they'll be able to hear your questions, as well as please identify yourself. So, Julia? Thank you. Yeah.
Come over here, Julia. Julia, come up front.
Yeah.
Thank you. Julia Brodowski with the Tribune Review. So in March, Controller Geisler came out and said that the real estate tax revenues could dip by up to $5.32 million. The numbers that your administration shared this week suggest closer to $6.7 million. Can you shed light as to how those were calculated, where you guys came up with that change?
Yeah, so the calculations that we produced yesterday and that have been shared with the task force and are in the process of being certified, they are based on primarily where we ended the second quarter and the pipeline of challenges that we see ahead of us, based primarily on common level ratio as well as on downtown tax appeals. Looking at the reduction in property tax revenue alone won't show you is the prior year tax collections that have come in that same period of time. So while appeals have lowered the base and have required us to pay out some refunds, we've been able to offset a significant proportion of those refunds through prior year collections. And that's what I think was not being discussed or predicted at that time, that is leading us to see a positive, or not a positive, in a more balanced and level result for the end of this year and how that'll fold into future years.
Bob Mayo from Pittsburgh's Action News. For the mayor, your deputy mayor has indicated that the forecast indicates we'll be able to avoid drastic cuts, which implies that there could be some cuts in the year ahead. That you see that more than 5% drop. Do you anticipate any job cuts? If there will be cuts that you consider not drastic, what would those non-drastic cuts be? And also, is there anything you can point to specifically that you feel constituted trying to generate unjustified fear?
Well, I'm sorry. One is we don't see no major job cuts coming down as of right now. But again, we will continue to monitor the budget, and if everything continues to go the way we forecast, and we don't see that. If things change, then we would alert the public of that. But right now, we don't see none of that. I'm not really going to speak to someone else's thought about invoking fear into anything. I think that's an individual. And I would be wrong to speak for anybody else. I'm not going to speak for anybody else. What we've said from day one, Bob, and you know this, is that we will be transparent about how we see the budget and what we're going to do, and we've done that. The numbers indicate that, they prove that. We're not going to lead by fear or creating any type of, statements that really don't meet what's going on just to be political. Once we're here to govern, not to be political. We're political people in political positions, but at the end of the day, we owe it to the residents to make sure that we're governing, being transparent in what we're doing, and that's what we've done, and we will continue to do that.
Just to add really quickly to the mayor's answer to your question, Bob, when we've done this in the past several budgets too, we could likely see the elimination of vacant positions or positions that aren't currently filled, that we've determined really operationally within departments that those positions aren't necessary or aren't the highest priority. But no cuts beyond that are really on our radar at this time. Most of the savings we would see generating on the expenditure side are coming from the same kind of savings that are leading to the $25 million under budget result this year. As we have found ways to achieve our objectives less expensively than we previously predicted, we're going to then show that we'll continue those efficiencies into the future. So when I say cuts, that's what I meant. Mostly operational efficiencies on the non-personnel side and maybe cleaning up some vacant positions.
Charlie Wolfson, Public Source. Looks like you're expecting the transfer tax to come in about $12 million short of what was expected. Could you explain why that is happening, and also why you are projecting it to stay down in the low 40 millions for the next 5 years?
Yeah, the de-transfer tax has been coming in lower than we expected. We believe almost exclusively because of the higher interest rates and a tight housing market. We had anticipated interest rate reductions based on what was coming out of the Fed in the last round of these projections. As we've seen that revenue line take a significant hit, we're learning more about how heavily impacted it is by interest rates. So we've lowered the assumptions about what's going to come in to reflect the fact that we understand that this sort of tight housing market is going to be around for a while. And we've kept it low because we realize that though there are signals from the Fed about interest rate reductions, until we actually see them start to make some of those cuts, we don't want to count on them. Right? So that's one of the conservative assumptions I was mentioning, to be sure that we're planning around only what we know. I think if we see significant interest rate cuts and that having a result on mortgage rates and having a result on property transactions a year from now, when we produce the next set of calculations, we might bump those up a bit. But for the purposes of this budget and 5-year plan, we want to make sure that we're only reflecting, what if interest rates remained high like they are now, and it was having that effect on those transactions.
Chris Hoffman, KDK. With some of the fight back on the job tax now, like losing out on that revenue and potentially pay some of the revenues from past years back, how does that factor into the forecast for the next 5 years?
Well, so we're currently before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court with an appeal, meaning that we are collecting the tax and we'll continue to collect it. We believe we'll continue to collect it for the foreseeable future because we're very confident in winning that case. But in any event, we will continue to collect it until we have a decision from the Supreme Court. So we really only lost out on that revenue for the first quarter of 2024 after the Commonwealth Court decision was rendered and before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court accepted the case. That's why it's coming in under projections for this year. We've only really started seeing payments coming in at the end of the second quarter because people have some time to make their payment after the event. But we do expect that one to level off into the future because we'll continue to collect. To your point about refunds, I do just want to note that none of the plaintiffs in that case requested refunds. So as part of their case, they only challenged the constitutionality of the tax itself. So I think it's an open question to be decided by the Supreme Court whether refunds are going to be a part of that case at all, regardless of the outcome. We can't know that now. That's not something we can predict.
I'm Julie Murray, with PSA. So both of you talked about expecting some kind of lean years coming. For your average Pittsburgher, what do you anticipate that people may notice in terms of a sign of that? Is it something that your average person would notice, or is it more internal?
I'll answer that for you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, well, there'll be more to come on that at the end of September and throughout the rest of the year as we finalize an actual spending plan. So I don't want to get too far ahead of us. We're still putting those together. But no, by and large, I don't think that the types of things that we're talking about here today would be things that the average resident on the street would notice, because we're not projecting any sort of major changes in services, right? We are projecting that we need to tighten our belts a little bit in terms of how we pay for those, but that is consistent with what we've been saying for the past 2 years. We will, one thing folks might notice, and they would have noticed this last year too, is that we have slowed down the pace in which we're starting new capital projects. That largely relates to how we're managing the city's debt until we get to those repayments on the other side of 2026. But there are a long list of investments in city facilities facilities and other types of capital projects that are still ongoing, and we'll continue to deliver those. We'll just be starting fewer than were the case for a while. And obviously infrastructure projects, bridge rehabilitations, landslide remediation, major transportation projects, they'll continue because we've been planning for them for some time and because of the state funding that goes into those.
I think that, as long as the residents see that core city services are still moving, we proved a lot in our core city services. As long as the residents see that, then that's what they want to see. At the end of the day, it all comes down to how we deliver core city services to our residents. And as long as they see that the garbage is being picked up on time, as long as they see that we're removing snow and everything else that we plan on doing and that we have done, then at that moment in time, I think that they won't see any type of problems. And if something was to arise where it changes the dynamic or the concept, we would come out and tell you.
Thanks, Mayor. With the expiration of the COVID relief fund, what is it that you can let residents or say to residents that may have been receiving services and programs that may dissolve or go away? How can you calm the minds of your residents from knowing that this is something that's going to take place?
So the COVID relief funds that the city has were the ones we're talking about today. A big portion of our COVID money was underpinning the operating budget. So that won't have any effect on direct services or programs that residents were participating in. That's how we paid some salaries for a few years as revenues came back. And that's the big impact we're talking about here today. Many of the other investments that we made from ARPA funds specifically were in capital projects that will be completed, and so they will have served that purpose, and we won't be relying on those anymore. A few of them have supported programs. The one that jumps to mind for me is the OWN PGH program at the Urban Redevelopment Authority, which has been an enormously successful first-time low-income homeowner program. It put about 158 people directly into their first homes as owners, and is still supporting the construction of many units of for sale to affordable home buyers right now. The funding there is fully authorized, right? Some of the money is still being spent, but the entire amount that was allotted to that program has been committed. We are looking right now at ways to identify new funding sources to bring further rounds of OMPGH back. But the initial ARPA phase has closed, but we very much want to see that program continue. I think a lot of the COVID relief programs that we're having the sort of direct service support to residents that you're referring to are administered by other agencies, so they'd be better able to answer those. That's not what the city's ARPA allocation really supported, but by and large, folks should not expect to see a change in basic city services. The projects that we're doing will continue to completion, and we're looking for new ways to fund some of the home ownership or affordable housing things that ARPA supported.
I thank you all for coming out to our fireside chat regarding the release of our revenue forecast report that we will give into the Joint Task Force yesterday. Any additional questions that you may have, please feel free to email me at olga.george@pittsburghpa.gov. Thank you all.